This is our first video dealing with the module that explores race and ethnicity. What I would like all of you to read is Chapter 7 in the textbook, and I should note that the title of Chapter 7 is merely focusing in on race, but I'm going to add ethnicity to our discussion. So the ethnicity component of these videos is not really that well represented in the textbook, and you're only going to get it here. So let's begin with the learning objective. There's only one for this first video. What I want to do is I'm going to look at the current official United States government definitions of our race categories. And what I'll be looking at is the way that our government defines the race categories in the year 2000 and the year 2010. They've been the same for both of those particular censuses. So why don't we start then by looking at what our government says are the official 5 races. And before I show them to you, I want to note something. And that is that what I'm showing you right here is only a reflection of what our government says. Governments in other countries, let's say Canada, Mexico, or Brazil, will have their own definition of race and race categories. In fact, an interesting point is that race categories vary by culture. And this leads to a conclusion. The conclusion that I think is really important to see almost immediately is that generally speaking, race isn't real. In fact, it's more of a socially or culturally produced phenomena. It's not really rooted in biological fact, but we'll get to that eventually. So let's begin then by looking at the official 5 races as our government defines it. There are 5, and I'm going to show them to you in one fell swoop. White, black, African American, American Indian, Asian, and then finally Native Hawaiian and Pacific Islander. The white category basically means that you as an individual have your origins in one of these 3 places. In other words, maybe not contemporarily, but it's where your genetic code, quote unquote, was forged. It's basically where you can trace your ancestry. So the white category, at least by our government's definition, means you have origins in Europe, the Middle East, and also North Africa. And if you're confused by what is meant by the term North Africa, it means the part of Africa that faces the Mediterranean Sea, very close to Europe, and would include countries like Egypt, Libya, Morocco, and Algeria. The second race category is black or African American, and again it has to do with origins. Where is your ancestry? In this case, it's origins in the remainder of Africa, not North Africa, but what geographers call sub-Saharan Africa. And that basically just means the southern 2/3 of the African continent south of the Saharan Desert. The third category is American Indian, also sometimes called Native American, and we can use those terms interchangeably, which basically again means origins in either North or South America. Also, we might add the Caribbean islands, because technically they are a part of North and South America. So what that means is that the American Indian category might include, to give just one example, Potawatomi, who are native to Wisconsin, but also Aztecs, who are native to Mexico, and Incas, who are native to what is today Peru. So it's the entire American continent system, both North and South America in terms of origins. The Asian category, somewhat problematic, because it actually brings together a lot of really diverse and potentially disparate and even opposing cultures. But as our government defines it, it means you have origins in or ancestry in East Asia, which would mean China or Japan, Southeast Asia, which would mean basically Vietnam or Indonesia, but also South Asia, which would mean India, Pakistan, Bangladesh, and a variety of other nearby countries. So the Asian category tends to be a category that has quite a lot of ethnic, national, religious, and in some cases even racial diversity within it. Finally, here in America, in the United States, we have a unique category that you'll find nowhere else in the world, and that is the Native Hawaiian / Pacific Islander category. which means you have origins, again, ancestry in the Pacific Islands. So Hawaii, obviously, but also places like Samoa and a variety of other small Polynesian, Melanesian, or Micronesian islands in the Pacific Ocean. The reason we have that category has to do, at least in part, with the fact that Hawaii became a state relatively recently, just back in 1959. And as a result, the United States has a unique relationship to the Pacific Island cultures. Imagine that Hawaiians might have lobbied our government to get included in the racial classification scheme, but that wouldn't be the case in Mexico, for example, or even in Canada. Now, a lot of you are probably curious. Notice I didn't say Hispanic. Almost always we think of Hispanic as another category that people use to describe themselves racially or ethnically. But in fact, Hispanic is a category used by our government, but it is not racial. So let me explain. If you are Hispanic or identify as Hispanic, you can actually be of any race. So Hispanic kind of transcends all of these categories, cuts across them, if you will. What it really means is kind of a heritage category. It means you're from a Spanish-speaking country. So if you're from Spain, technically, if you've come to the United States, you are Hispanic, in the eyes of our government anyway. You could call yourself whatever you want to call yourself, but the government wants to put you into a category, and in this case, Hispanic would be the preferred choice. Mexico, of course, a Spanish-speaking country by and large, or perhaps Peru or Cuba. All of them, what they have in common is they are Spanish-speaking countries. Now, just to prove that this idea of Hispanic, in terms of how it kind of cuts across race categories, I want to give you a few examples. What if you're from Puerto Rico and you are, in terms of your racial identity, African American? That's possible. There's a lot of people who live in Puerto Rico who are of sub-Saharan African heritage. But you also speak Spanish, right? Because people in Puerto Rico speak Spanish by and large. You could be black and Hispanic. And you could also be white and Hispanic. Let's say you're from Mexico, but you don't really identify as any of the others. You might check the white box, which actually is quite typical. About 50% of the immigrants from Mexico and the United States gravitate towards checking the white box. So Hispanic is kind of a unique category, therefore, again, cutting across all of these race categories. All right, I want to show you this map of the world because what it turns out to be is that the American definition of race is largely geographical, and I'll explain that in just a few moments' time. But I have this crude map of the world, and unfortunately these very crude lines that I've drawn on top of it. And these lines basically represent the borders, quote unquote, for, I should say, I apologize, the races. So over here in the Americas, notice both North America and South America is in one category. That is the American Indian category. So people who have ancestry, long-term ancestry in the Americas. That then is the Native American or Indian category. The white category is here. Notice it includes Europe, but also the Middle East and the northern tier of Africa, which geographers typically call North Africa. African American / black, here sub-Saharan Africa, so the majority of the African landmass, but south of the Saharan desert. And then finally, the biggest category in terms of geographic area is Asia, where you've got places like China, India, Japan, and also, of course, Southeast Asia in through here. Now, the only thing I'm not showing you on this map is the geographic border for the Hawaiian and Pacific Islander category, but it would basically be over here. It's just that the map doesn't show the Pacific very well. So I want to just provide one more thing in terms of kind of a summary of what we might say about the way our government defines race and the race categories. I've already kind of indicated this, but I want to make it really clear. The way our government defines the racial classification scheme is based, therefore, on geography. It's basically answering the question where you're from. Where your genetic code was forged, I suppose, is another way of putting that. Basically, where's your ancestry? What part of the world is your family deeply connected to? And that then, of course, determines your race. Now, you're probably thinking, well, duh, isn't that the only way to define race? No, there are other ways, which we'll talk about a little bit later on. It's a very common way to do it, and it happens to be the way our culture typically does it, but it's not actually scientific, as you'll find out a little later on. One final note, our government's definition of race is only obliquely related to phenotype. Now, what am I saying there? Phenotype is basically the characterization of the outward appearance of the human body. So it could, for example, include skin pigmentation. The lighter your skin, the darker your skin. Obviously, that varies over the entire human family. Eye shape, the so-called East Asian eye versus the Western eye in terms of the morphology of the eye. All of these things vary as you go to different parts of the world. And other things also vary with regard to human phenotype. So a lot of us think, hey, race is about skin color, but in fact it's not. The way that our government defines race is only just a little bit related to phenotype. And I can prove it to you by going back to the map that we just looked at. Just to give you one example, here in the so-called white category, there's a huge amount of diversity. The people who have origins up here in Scandinavia, they're quite fair in terms of skin pigmentation and also perhaps hair color. But in North Africa, quite obviously, skin pigmentation tends, it's not always true, but it tends to be darker. So there's a huge variation in skin pigmentation within the so-called white race. The same thing is true over here in Asia, the Asian racial classification that our government uses. Well, in China, you do have the East Asian eye, or epicantic eye fold, as it is called. But in India, you do not. And so there's a lot of diversity of phenotype here. And the same thing is true in sub-Saharan Africa. There are parts of sub-Saharan Africa where skin pigmentation is quite light, especially down here in the southwest. And other places where, especially near the equator, it's quite dark. So, to summarize, the way our government defines race is rooted in geography, that's pretty clear, but it's only just a little bit, or obliquely, related to variations in human phenotype. We'll address these issues with a little bit more clarity when we come back in the second video.